They mocked his rusted rig and faded jacket, just an old man clinging to the past. But when a decorated colonel froze at the sight of a worn decal on his door, everything changed. Who was this silent trucker, and what had he carried through the fire? The Crossroads Diner sat like a stubborn relic at the edge of two crumbling highways, where the plains rolled flat and the wind never stopped howling. A sagging neon sign buzzed weakly above the entrance, flickering the word, "Open," like a half-kept promise. Dust clung to the windows, and the smell of diesel and bacon fat clung to everything else. Inside, time had its own pace. Photos of truckers long gone were tacked along the back wall. Some framed, most not. Smiling faces, mud-splattered rigs, Polaroids curling at the edges. The kind of place that smelled like hot coffee, worn leather, and yesterday's regrets. In the corner booth, Hank Mercer sat like part of the decor. He wore the same frayed denim jacket he always did, the collar permanently stained, the elbows patched. His hands, gnarled and calloused, cradled a chipped white mug. Black coffee, no sugar. His truck keys sat beside it on the table, dangling from a keychain that had once been an army dog tag, edges rubbed smooth over time. Outside, his rig idled, an aging Kenworth, dark green beneath layers of road grime, its chrome dulled by wind and grit. On the driver's door, a decal, oval-shaped, barely visible under years of sun and rain. Faded gold wings above a red cross, the kind you had to squint to even notice. Hank didn't speak much. His presence was enough, like a slow-moving storm cloud you respected but didn't question. The bell above the diner door rang. In came David Langston, freshly pressed slacks, shiny brown boots that had never touched a truck step, aviator sunglasses, company-issued jacket with a crisp logistics logo stitched above the breast pocket. He was young, 28. Head office had sent him on a morale tour, a PR stunt disguised as a get-to-know-the-field initiative. David's eyes swept the diner with a hint of amusement, then something close to disdain. His hand hovered near his phone, half hoping for a signal. "Is there Wi-Fi here?" he asked aloud. Alice gave him a dry look from behind the counter. "We serve pie. That's our connection." She was in her 50s, hair pulled into a practical bun, green apron dusted with flour. Alice ran the diner with the precision of a battlefield nurse, and she didn't care much for suits. David slid into a booth and glanced out the window. His eyes landed on Hank's truck. "Whose relic is that?" he said, loud enough for Hank to hear. Alice looked over her glasses. "That's Hank's." David scoffed. "That thing should be in a museum. How does it even pass inspection?" Hank didn't flinch, just took another sip of his coffee. Alice, not one to tolerate disrespect on her turf, wiped her hands and leaned against the counter. "That relic once pulled a school bus full of kids out of a snowbank on Route 72. No headlights, middle of the night, roads iced over." David raised an eyebrow. Was that before or after the dinosaurs went extinct? Alice didn't blink. Before social media, so no likes, just a man and a chain and a heater stuck on high. David laughed, but it came out thin. "Look, I get it. Sentimental stuff. But the industry's changing. Safety standards, emissions, optimization. We're not hauling freedom, just freight." Hank's barely on the dispatch grid. He's what? Pushing 70. Hank finally looked up. His voice was gravel, low and steady. 72. David paused. Hank's gaze was calm, but not soft. Alice leaned in. "You ever break down in a whiteout, David?" David blinked. "No. Why would I?" "Exactly." She cut him off. "You'd call roadside." Hank was roadside. David shifted in his seat. All due respect, that might have mattered once. But now, efficiency is everything. Mileage, deadhead ratio, delivery windows. A rig like his just slows the chain. The bell above the door jingled again as two more truckers came in. Hank nodded at them. They nodded back. No words needed. David noticed but didn't understand. Still, something about the way Alice had spoken stuck in his mind. Later, as he stood outside, waiting for his rental's engine to warm up, he glanced again at Hank's truck. He took a few steps closer. The rig was massive up close, weathered and hulking, its paint flaking around the edges like tree bark. His eyes landed on the decal. Something about it stirred a vague memory from an old training slideshow or military logistics manual. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo just in case. Inside the diner, Alice refilled Hank's coffee. "You handled that well." Hank shrugged. "He's young. Knows a lot of things that don't matter yet." She smiled. "You always say that." Outside, David drove off, muttering to himself, but with the image of that decal still on his phone screen. He didn't know why, but something about it wouldn't leave him alone. And Hank, back in his booth, watched the highway through the window. A slow breeze rattled the panes. He took another sip of coffee. The decal, barely visible in the morning light, caught the sun just enough to glint. The Truckers' Tribute Rally was a once-a-year affair. A mix of food trucks, country music, diesel fumes, and a kind of respect that didn't need to be loud to be real. It was held in a vast gravel lot behind the county fairgrounds, with hand-painted banners flapping in the breeze. "Keep America rolling. Every load matters. No freight left behind." David Langston hadn't planned on staying the weekend, but after some gentle nudging from Alice, and a not-so-gentle email from corporate, he found himself navigating through rows of parked semis, their grills polished, flags mounted high, chrome reflecting the late morning sun. He wore the same company-issued jacket, now dusted from the wind, and kept checking his watch. This was supposed to be a networking event. Shake hands, collect business cards, take a few photos for the company blog. Nothing more. But from the moment he stepped onto the rally grounds, something felt different. The crowd wasn't what he expected. Sure, there were the grizzled lifers, their arms tanned and burned from decades behind the wheel. But there were also young drivers, 20-somethings with tattoos and Bluetooth headsets, leaning against rigs they'd saved years for. Families milled around too, kids sitting on flatbeds eating funnel cakes, old-timers telling stories around folding chairs. David wandered past booths selling trucker merch, handmade patches, and greasy burgers served on paper plates. A small stage had been set up near the back lot. Speakers played classic rock while organizers prepped for the afternoon ceremony. A volunteer driver recognition, headlined by someone David had only heard about in dispatch briefs, Colonel Graham Walker, retired 4-star general and a legend in military logistics. The name barely registered for David. He was more interested in snapping a few PR-friendly shots and getting through his checklist. Then he saw the truck, that same rig parked near the back, still dark green and stubbornly dignified in its age. Hank had backed it in perfectly straight. No polish, no banners, just presence. David paused. He hadn't expected Hank to show up. The old man was seated in a folding chair beside the cab, sipping something from a thermos and nodding occasionally to drivers who passed by with a respectful glance or a clap on the shoulder. David approached, uncertain. "You made it," he said, hands in his pockets. Hank looked up and squinted. "You again." David offered a half-smile. "I figured I'd see what this is all about." Hank nodded toward the crowd. "Then stop staring at me and go listen." It wasn't warm, but it wasn't unkind either. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Heads turned. The stage mic squealed once before the announcer spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome a man who's moved more soldiers and supplies than most of us have hauled freight, Colonel Graham Walker." Applause followed as the colonel took the stage. He was tall, ramrod straight despite his years, his dress uniform immaculate even under the dusty afternoon light. Rows of ribbons lined his chest. His hair was white, his jaw square, and his eyes sharp, like he never truly left the battlefield. He began with practiced cadence. "I came today not to talk about war, but about those who carry the weight when no one's looking." David half listened at first. It sounded like a speech he'd heard before, honoring volunteers, praising sacrifice. He was about to pull out his phone when the colonel's voice faltered. Mid-sentence, he stopped. His gaze had shifted, locked onto something in the distance. The crowd followed his eyes. There, near the edge of the lot, stood Hank's truck. More specifically, the decal. Colonel Walker stepped off the stage. He walked slowly through the crowd, each footfall deliberate. People parted to let him pass. Silence spread like ripples in water. David's pulse picked up. He turned to Hank, who was now standing beside his truck, arms crossed, brow furrowed. The colonel stopped in front of the Kenworth. For a long moment he just stared at the decal. Then, in one precise movement, he brought his hand to his brow and saluted. The silence cracked. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" The colonel lowered his hand and stepped closer, brushing the edge of the worn decal with his fingertips. "This," he said softly, "was only issued to 12 men during Operation Silent Echo, a mobile medevac and supply team that ran routes no one else would touch. Under fire, in blackout zones, through insurgent-held territories." He turned to face the crowd. "And this man," he nodded to Hank, "was the reason I still have a spine. My convoy was hit. Communications were down. We had no way out. And out of the dust came this truck. No escort, no orders. Just him." Gasps. A few hands rose instinctively in salute. David stood frozen. Hank shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't come here for speeches," he muttered. Walker turned to him. "Then let me finish it. You drove wounded men through gunfire. You hauled a mobile triage in the middle of a mortar storm. You never filed for a medal. You didn't even tell us your last name." Hank shrugged. "Didn't need to." Walker smiled. "You still don't. But I needed to say it. Because too many forget what quiet heroes look like." The crowd applauded, slowly at first, then thunderously. David felt like the earth had shifted under his feet. All his spreadsheets, his delivery stats, his policy memos, none of it prepared him for this. For the weight of silence. For the way men like Hank wore history not on their chests but in the way they stood. In the quiet dignity of a man who never asked to be seen. Later, David found himself walking alone through rows of rigs. He couldn't stop thinking about the salute. About the look in the colonel's eyes. About how Hank never mentioned a word of it. He passed a younger driver wiping down his truck, talking to his kid on speakerphone. He paused, watching for a moment, seeing now what he had never truly noticed before. Not just freight, lives, burdens, sacrifices, and behind all of it, men like Hank. 3 days after the rally, David Langston was still replaying the moment in his head. The colonel's salute, the weight behind those few words, the way Hank had stood unmoved, almost annoyed by the attention, like it meant nothing at all. David had driven back to his hotel that night in silence, skipping the calls from HQ and ignoring texts from colleagues asking for updates or photo ops. Something in him had cracked open, and now he couldn't look away from it. He showed up at the Crossroads diner the next morning before sunrise. The neon sign flickered as always. Inside, Alice was kneading dough behind the counter. She looked up, unsurprised. "Didn't think you'd be back," she said, not pausing her rhythm. David hesitated. "Is Hank here?" "He left about 20 minutes ago. Headed west." David blinked. "He's not on the manifest. Dispatch doesn't have anything logged." Alice looked at him carefully. "Not everything worth hauling fits in a database." She wiped her hands, grabbed a second thermos from the back counter, and handed it to him. "You want to understand Hank? You follow the dust trail." David got in his rental, hesitated, then changed course. He drove until he saw Hank's rig up ahead, the familiar green Kenworth W900 rolling steadily through the outskirts of town, leaving a plume of pale dust in its wake. David stayed behind at a respectful distance, unsure what he'd say when he caught up, if anything. After nearly 2 hours of rough roads, they crossed into a dry basin at the edge of the desert. No signs, no landmarks, only wind, sand, and scrub trees. Finally, Hank pulled off onto a rutted dirt track, and David followed. The trail ended at what looked like an abandoned warehouse, its paint peeled and its roof rusting under the sun. But as Hank backed the truck in with practiced ease, David noticed subtle signs of life. A makeshift antenna, fresh tire marks, footprints in the dust. David parked and stepped out, shielding his eyes. "What is this place?" he asked. Hank didn't look at him. "Help me unload." Inside the trailer were crates, not company stock. Boxes labeled with military surplus markings, medical kits, canned goods, blankets, even children's vitamins. David instinctively reached for his clipboard, then stopped himself. They unloaded in silence. Soon, others began arriving. First, an older man in a wheelchair, followed by a younger woman with a toddler on her hip. Then two more, a former Marine with burn scars and a weathered veteran with trembling hands. No fanfare, no lines, just quiet nods and handshakes. They weren't customers. They weren't part of any program. David realized what was happening. This wasn't a delivery. This was a lifeline. Hank gave a small pack of batteries to the man with tremors, helped the woman lift a bag of powdered milk, and handed a folded poncho to a boy barely old enough to talk. David finally spoke. "You've been doing this. How long?" Hank adjusted his gloves. "Since the last supply chain cut them off. Maybe longer." David stared. "With your own money? Sometimes mine, sometimes others. Doesn't matter." David was quiet for a long beat. "But why not tell someone? File a report. Build a network." Hank looked up at him. "You think silence means nobody cares? Silence is how some of us cope. These folks, they don't need another system. They need consistency. Someone who shows up." As the sun dipped lower, casting long orange shadows across the cracked concrete, Hank pulled a camp stove and firewood from the side compartment. They built a small fire behind the warehouse. Not for cooking, just for the comfort of heat and conversation. David sat on an overturned crate, a cup of Alice's coffee in hand. He looked over at Hank, who stared into the fire like it carried memories instead of flame. "Did you ever think of stopping?" David asked. Hank sipped from his thermos. "I think about a lot of things. Doesn't mean I do 'em." He poked the fire, watching embers spark upward into the night. David hesitated. "The colonel said you saved his life." Hank didn't respond right away. Then, "Did what needed doing." David leaned forward. "Why never talk about it?" Hank's voice was low. "Because there were others who didn't come back. Others who didn't get stories told. You start telling yours, you start making it about you." A silence fell, heavy but not uncomfortable. The kind that didn't need filling. A rusted windmill squeaked nearby. Coyotes howled somewhere beyond the ridge. Later, as they packed up, Hank handed David a folded list, handwritten, neat block letters. "What's this?" David asked. "People, places, needs. If you're serious about making a difference, start there." David looked down at the list. It was longer than he expected. Back at the diner the next morning, David sat quietly at the counter while Alice poured coffee. "He took you out to the warehouse?" she asked. David nodded. "Did he tell you about his son?" David looked up. "No," she dried a plate slowly. "David Mercer, Army medic, killed in action during his 3rd deployment. Got caught in an ambush. Hank never talks about it. Never asked for a plaque or even a flag. Just kept driving." David swallowed hard. "Did anyone ever honor him?" Alice shook her head. "Hank made a vow. Said if the system forgot the ones left behind, he wouldn't. That's why he runs those routes. Why he wears that jacket. That decal's not a decoration. It's a debt." David looked down at his hands, suddenly feeling small. Alice added quietly, "Not all heroes want to be seen. Some just want to keep their promise." Outside, the truck was parked in its usual spot. The decal still faded, still ghosted by the sun. But now, to David's eyes, it looked like a medal no one could ever pin, but everyone should salute. The second truckers' tribute rally came faster than anyone expected. This time, the banners were bigger, the turnout larger. The lot buzzed with life. Semis lined up like metal monuments, flags waving from their mirrors, families gathered around tailgates, and country music echoing over portable speakers. There was pride in the air, but also something heavier beneath it, a sense of shared burden, a reverence. David Langston walked through the crowd with a different posture now. Gone were the pressed slacks and corporate smile. He wore jeans, scuffed boots, and a navy flannel and no clipboard. Instead, He carried a folder under his arm, stuffed with handwritten notes, forms, and proposals. He wasn't here to observe anymore. He was here to listen. Near the edge of the rally space, Hank's Kenworth W900 stood like it had always stood. Quiet, unpolished, timeless. The sun caught its dark green frame, glinting off the side mirror. The decal on the door, faded to a whisper of gold and red, shimmered in the afternoon light. People gave the truck space. Not out of pity, out of respect. David stood near it, arms folded. He nodded to drivers as they passed, many tipping their hats or offering a silent salute. A few asked if Hank would be speaking. David only smiled and said, "You'll see." The makeshift stage had been upgraded since the last rally. Better sound system, wooden steps. A banner overhead read, "Unsung Roads, Unseen Heroes." The host called names, handed out plaques, posed for photos. Then came the pause, the kind that falls before something important. "And now," the host said, his voice steady, "we'd like to invite someone who never asked to be recognized, but who has carried more than any of us knew. A man whose story reminds us that courage doesn't always come with medals. Sometimes it comes with silence, steel, and miles no one else would drive." David glanced over. Hank stood a few paces behind the truck, arms at his sides. Alice nudged him forward. "Go," she said, "before they start clapping just for your shadow." Hank grunted. "This ain't my kind of thing." "Exactly," Alice replied. "That's why it matters." Slowly, deliberately, Hank stepped up to the microphone. The crowd quieted instantly. No fanfare, no music. Hank looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, drivers and families, some who had hauled for decades, others just starting out. He cleared his throat. "I ain't got a speech," he began, voice gravel low, "so I'll keep it short." He paused, eyes scanning the horizon. "Service ain't about the miles you log. It's about the loads you carry when no one's watching." Another pause, this one deeper. "It's about keeping a promise you made to someone who ain't here anymore. About remembering that not all weight goes on a scale. Some of it, you carry right here." He tapped his chest just once, above the heart. Silence. Then slow, rising applause. Not the kind that erupts, the kind that builds like dawn breaking through fog. David felt something shift in the crowd. Some stood straighter. Some lowered their heads. Some just wiped at their eyes. Hank didn't wait for more. He stepped down, walked back to his rig, and sat on the side step like he always did. Calm. Still. Done. But the echo of his words lingered. Later that night, David sat across from Alice in the diner's office. Papers covered the table. A hand-drawn map of rural supply stops. Budget estimates. A simple logo. A faded winged decal with a heartbeat line beneath it. "I want to call it the Mercer Route Initiative," David said. "A way to support drivers who go off the grid. Deliver to places no one tracks. Help the folks who fall through." Alice sipped her tea. "He'll hate it." "I know," she smiled. "But it's the right thing." David nodded. "We'll keep his name on the paperwork. Not the banners." Outside the window, Hank's rig sat beneath the stars. Unmoved. Unchanging. Weeks passed. The initiative launched quietly, just how Hank preferred it. No press release. Just resources rerouted. Supplies sent where they were needed most. David took a demotion to stay with the program. He said it was a promotion in disguise. Alice kept the diner running like a heartbeat, a place where stories could land and rest. And Hank? He kept driving. Same route, same thermos, same jacket. But now, when someone called his truck a relic, David was the first to answer. One afternoon, at a gas station outside Amarillo, a young driver in a clean new Peterbilt chuckled as Hank pulled in. "Man, that thing still runs?" David was nearby, filling up a box of supplies in the back of his own van. He stood up, walked over, looked the kid in the eye. "Yeah," David said, "and so do the lives it saved." The driver blinked. "What?" David just smiled. "Keep rolling, kid. You'll get it." The Peterbilt pulled off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. David turned back to Hank, who was watching from the cab. You didn't have to do that, Hank said. David shrugged. You never did either. But here we are. A long moment passed between them. No words, just the quiet kind of understanding built not on conversation, but on miles shared and truths carried. The decal on the Kenworth caught the sun again, no longer a relic, a badge of every mile that mattered. This story reminds us that true service often goes unseen, and real heroes don't seek applause. If you met someone like Hank, would you recognize the weight they carry? Comment below. And if this story moved you, please give it a like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey, where every mile tells a story.